Apparently there is a blues and jazz jam here after the Science Cafe, and had I known this, maybe I would have brought my bass and done double duty, but we'll have to do that some other time.
Every Tuesday.
Every Tuesday?
Right.
Fantastic. Maybe I will do that sometime. So as Dorothy said, I'm a personality psychologist, and my primary area of research is personality and emotion. But in thinking about the types of personality traits that are necessary to survive in a hostile situation, there's a lot of things to be said about that as well. So NASA does do screening of potential astronauts. They have a very extensive screening process. I don't know all the details of that, but at least some of what they do has to do with astronaut personality. There's several personality traits that, as an astronaut, you want to have, and primarily those are going to fall in what we call the Big Five personality traits. Research has identified 5 sort of major families of personality traits that tend to describe almost all individuals. They describe individuals from all cultural backgrounds, equally across genders, basically across any group that you could think of. Those are, and I'll explain what these are shortly, extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. And so if we think about these 5 different personality traits and how desirable they are in astronauts, there's several that come to mind. One of the first ones is agreeableness, and agreeableness, in short, is niceness. If you're an agreeable person, you are very sort of warm and fuzzy. People like to be around you. You tend to trust other people and be trustworthy yourself. You tend to be sort of modest and humble, not self-absorbed, not aloof, and that sort of thing. And it's very, very important in a situation like space travel, where you're going to be cooped up in a very small space with the same few people for an extended period of time. When you're in a very, dangerous and stressful situation, it's important that you are a nice person who cooperates well with other people. So it's one of the primary things that they look for after they rule out things like psychological disorders. You also look for things in an astronaut like emotional stability. I mentioned neuroticism as one of the Big Five traits, and that's sort of the opposite of emotional stability. If you're neurotic, probably heard this term before, you are very anxious, maybe you are very moody, you have a lot of fluctuations in mood, you're irritable, you're easily angered. These are not traits that are going to play very well if you're cooped up with a couple of people for a couple of years in space. We saw in the movie that both of these traits were very, very important for Watney's success. We saw some scenes in the opening part of the movie that really established both his and the rest of the crew's agreeableness. They were very nice to each other. They got on very well, very harmoniously. We also saw evidence of Watney's emotional stability. And this is especially important because, as Dorothy and I discussed on the radio earlier, most of our first reaction, if we get stranded on a foreign planet and we're the only human on that planet, is panic. Well, Watney doesn't really panic. It's sort of amazing. His training comes into play, but so does his personality. He handles it pretty well. He goes into problem-solving mode, and he's able to, instead of panicking, instead of having that pronounced stress reaction, simply doing what needs to be done to survive. Another thing that really helped Watney out, and this is sort of at the intersection of what I do, personality and cognitive psychology, as Andrew mentioned, is a concept called functional fixedness, aka, why does Jennifer have a hammer? I waved this at you when Linda talked about heckling, so just keep in mind that I do have a blunt object here. So why do I have a hammer? Functional fixedness is a concept that has to deal with how you think about objects and their usefulness. Functional fixedness means that when an object is used for a certain purpose, you tend to not be able to think outside of that box very much. You tend to be sort of limited to an object's typical use, and functional fixedness is even more pronounced when we're in a very stressful type of situation, like being the only human stranded on Mars. For example, Watney was able to overcome functional fixedness, both because he was a really smart guy, he was probably a natural problem solver, but also because he had that training that allowed him to, instead of freaking out, automatically begin to solve those problems. And so he was not limited to seeing the objects he had available to him as what they're typically used for, but he was able to think outside the box. He used a lot of things in different ways than we probably would because we don't have that training. He used a plutonium core, not for power, but for heat. He used plastic sheeting to create a greenhouse. He used materials that maybe you wouldn't have thought to use in order to create a spark. He opened up the poo container, and that was the unpleasant task Andrew was referring to. I'll go ahead and say it. To use those packets of poo as fertilizer and that sort of thing. So when we think about functional fixedness, the reason I have this hammer is that typically when you have a hammer, you've heard the phrase, when you have a hammer, all your problems start to look like what? Nails. Okay? So if you are stranded on Mars and you find yourself with a hammer, what are the typical things that are going to come to mind to do with this hammer?
Digging.
Maybe digging. What else over here?
I think find some nails was what I heard.
Find some nails. Yes. Well, probably you will tend to use it to whack things. Maybe bust something open. Maybe use the little, nail prier here to kind of pry something open. Things that use the hammer effectively as a lever. But things that you probably would not think of because you would be freaking out, as would any normal person, might be using this to wedge something open, to kind of prop it up, to use the hammer as a counterweight to some kind of pulley system, to melt the rubber off the handle and remold it into something else that you need, or maybe even melt down the head of the hammer if you need a kind of metal object that you don't have. But Watney was able to overcome that sort of thing by simply problem solving and not freaking out. So there were a lot of things that he had going on in terms of his psychology in addition to that problem-solving training that helped him survive much, much better than I think any of the rest of us would in that situation.